The human body is capable of extraordinary things. It can push past pain, exhaustion, even starvation, if the mind is strong enough. But what happens when the mind itself starts to break? When the sun scorches your skin, the wind blinds your eyes, and the silence of the desert becomes deafening? For one man, this wasn't just a question. It was his reality. This gripping tale of survival against all odds will leave you questioning what you're capable of when pushed to the edge. Stay with us until the end to uncover the untold story. And if you want more incredible real-life stories like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Outdoor Havoc for more wild, real-life tales from the extremes. In 1994, one of the most unimaginable survival stories unfolded in the heart of the Sahara Desert, a place known for its unforgiving heat, endless dunes, and brutal isolation. It was here that Mauro Prosperi, a marathon runner with a passion for long-distance racing, found himself in a race not against his competitors, but against time and the raw power of nature itself. The Marathon des Sables is not your average race. Held annually in Morocco, it is known as one of the most grueling endurance events in the world. Runners from all over the globe gather to compete in the race's extreme conditions. Temperatures that soar above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, endless sand dunes, and rugged terrain that tests both physical and mental strength. For Mauro Prosperi, the race was the culmination of years of preparation. A veteran marathoner, he was no stranger to long-distance events. However, the Sahara would push him beyond the limits of anything he'd ever experienced. On that fateful day in 1994, the runners lined up at the starting line, eager to take on the challenge. The race began under the brutal midday sun, and for Mauro, everything felt as it should: exciting, challenging, and full of adrenaline. The race wasn't just a physical test, it was a test of one's mental fortitude. Participants had to navigate through miles of unmarked desert, relying on their skills and the small amount of water and food they carried with them. Mauro ran with determination, fueled by the hope of finishing strong. With each mile, the desert became more oppressive, its unrelenting heat making the air feel thick and suffocating. Yet, he had trained for this moment, and his preparation gave him the confidence that he could face whatever the Sahara threw at him. But then, something went horribly wrong. It wasn't a lack of skill or strength, it was something far more unpredictable: nature. The race organizers had planned checkpoints for the runners, but the vastness of the desert made it easy for even the most experienced competitors to lose their way. As Mauro pushed forward, a sudden sandstorm rolled in. The wind howled, turning the air into a blinding wall of dust. Visibility dropped to near zero. With no distinct landmarks in sight, Mauro made the mistake of veering off course. In the blink of an eye, the vast desert landscape swallowed him whole, and he became completely disoriented. At first, he tried to retrace his steps, but the endless sea of dunes made it impossible. Panic began to set in as Mauro realized he had no idea where he was. He had no GPS, no map, no way of contacting anyone. Just a lone figure, lost in the heart of one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. What was supposed to be a race became something far worse: an overwhelming, unrelenting battle for survival. With each passing hour, the chances of rescue grew slimmer, and the terrifying realization of his isolation began to sink in. Mauro was alone in the desert, and the Sahara would not be kind. This was the beginning of his nightmare. As the hours stretched into a relentless blur of scorching heat and choking dust, Mauro Prosperi's situation grew more dire. He had set out for a race, but now he was lost, isolated in one of the most brutal environments on Earth, with no clear way out. The desert, with its endless horizon and overwhelming silence, swallowed every trace of civilization. Mauro's only hope was to find the next checkpoint, but with no idea where he was or how to reach it, the situation seemed hopeless. He had no choice but to keep moving, driven by a primal instinct to survive. The blistering heat of the Sahara was already beginning to take its toll. With each step, the weight of the desert's unforgiving terrain pressed harder against him. His water supply, intended to last for the race, dwindled rapidly under the scorching sun. The blistering temperatures drained his energy, and his body began to break down. But it wasn't just the physical strain. Mauro was also fighting a battle in his mind. The psychological pressure of being alone in the desert, unable to find any sign of life or direction, began to push him to the edge. His mind raced with the harsh realities of his situation. The feeling of isolation grew suffocating, and each passing hour felt like an eternity. The fear of never being found, of dying out here in the desert, was a constant companion. Yet, despite it all, Mauro continued to push forward, refusing to give in. It wasn't long before the sheer vastness of the Sahara overwhelmed his sense of direction. He tried to remember the path he had taken earlier in the day, but everything looked the same, an endless expanse of dunes shifting in the wind. His head began to spin from dehydration, and dizziness clouded his vision. By now, he had been lost for hours, maybe even days. Time had no meaning in the desert. It was just a blur of survival instincts and desperate hope. In the deepening despair, the moments when he considered giving up crept into his thoughts. But then, something strange happened. Amid the suffocating silence, he began to hear something that seemed impossible in such an arid place. A sound, distant but undeniable, a faint rustling in the sand. Mauro stumbled toward the sound, his heart racing with a fleeting glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure if it was real, or if his mind had begun to play tricks on him in his state of delirium. But as he got closer, he saw it. A small bat, hidden in the sand, seemingly the last sign of life in this desolate wasteland. His body screamed for water, his throat parched beyond belief, but his instinct to survive overpowered everything else. This bat, an unlikely source of hope, could offer him something, a drop of life in the midst of certain death. With trembling hands, Mauro managed to catch the bat, but what followed was far more desperate than anyone could imagine. He didn't have the luxury of thinking about the morality of his actions. In that moment, he needed to survive. He used the bat's blood as his only source of hydration. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him alive for a little longer. But that wasn't the only measure Mauro would take to sustain himself. His ordeal was only beginning, and the horrors of survival in the desert would push him to extremes no human should ever have to endure. The darkness of the Sahara had him in its grip, but Mauro's will to live kept him moving forward, even as the desert threatened to claim him. The Sahara Desert is not a place for weakness. It doesn't offer mercy. It is a ruthless expanse where survival is a game of chance, and Mauro Prosperi was playing it with every ounce of strength he had left. The bat's blood had kept him alive, but it wasn't enough to reverse the toll the desert was taking on his body. His muscles were stiff and sore, his skin cracked and blistered from the relentless sun, and his mind was beginning to fracture under the crushing isolation. Yet, survival, against all odds, demanded that he keep pushing forward. Mauro had no choice but to think creatively, and when all seemed lost, he made another desperate choice. The air around him was thick with heat and despair, but he spotted something else: urine, his own. At that point, it wasn't a matter of pride or dignity, it was survival. The harsh reality of the Sahara was that he had nothing left, not even water, and his body was beginning to betray him. He carefully rationed his urine, drinking it in small sips to stave off the crushing thirst. It wasn't ideal, it wasn't pleasant, but it was something that could keep him alive for just a bit longer. The idea of drinking his own waste was nauseating, but in the face of death, it was a small price to pay. With each drop, Mauro forced himself to endure, his mind becoming more and more focused on the singular goal: surviving. The moments that followed were pure instinct. He knew that he couldn't go on forever, but he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to the brink. His thoughts became fragmented, and time seemed to stretch and bend, with each day blurring into the next. His body was a shell of what it had once been, his energy spent. But the human spirit is a powerful thing, and Mauro's will to survive was unyielding. The psychological toll of the desert's vast emptiness was starting to break him down in ways that were as dangerous as the physical hardships. Mauro had always been a disciplined and strong-willed man, but even he was not immune to the terror of complete isolation. He started to hallucinate. His mind, starved of both water and hope, played tricks on him. He imagined hearing voices, seeing shapes in the distance that weren't really there. Was there help nearby? Or was it just his mind trying to save him from the overwhelming despair? It was hard to tell, and that uncertainty made every step feel heavier than the last. But he pressed on, driven by the nagging thought that if he stopped, if he gave in to the desert, it would all be over. His body may have been failing him, but his resolve wasn't. Not yet. Yet, the physical strain was beginning to show. His vision had become blurry, his heart thumping erratically in his chest, and his legs shaky. He was exhausted, but his mind, stubborn and determined, pushed him further. Mauro's thoughts began to turn inward, to reflect on what had brought him here. How had this happened? He was a champion marathon runner. He had faced many challenges in his life, but none of them had prepared him for this. With every painful step, a wave of disbelief crashed over him. The seemingly endless sea of sand and heat, the weight of failure, and the haunting thought that he might never see his family again weighed heavily on his heart. In that bleak moment, it wasn't about winning or losing, it was about survival. And still, there was a flicker of hope, however faint. Mauro's survival instinct refused to let go. He knew that each step he took could be his last, but he also knew that if he stopped, if he gave up, he would never have the chance to live again. His struggle was no longer just against the desert, it was a battle with his own mind. Would his body give up first, or would his mind? The fight for survival in the Sahara was becoming more intense than ever, but Mauro kept moving forward. Every agonizing second was one step closer to either salvation or an untimely end. He wasn't sure which it would be, but as long as there was a shred of hope, he refused to stop. Just when it seemed like Mauro couldn't endure any longer, the desert played its hand. His exhaustion had reached a breaking point, but then, through the haze of delirium and disorientation, something extraordinary happened. In the distance, he spotted movement, figures on the horizon. His heart raced, hope stirring deep within him. Could it be? Was it finally a sign of help? It was a group of nomads, the Bedouins, who had been traversing the desert in their traditional, time-honored way. Mauro, barely able to stand, stumbled toward them, shouting in the faintest voice he could muster. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed like salvation had arrived. The nomads, recognizing the stricken runner in front of them, brought him into their fold. They offered him food, water, and some much-needed shelter from the blistering heat of the desert. Mauro, in a haze of relief and disbelief, accepted what they gave him. The water he drank felt like liquid life coursing through his veins. The food, though sparse, seemed like a banquet. He had tasted despair, But now, for a brief moment, he was tasting the sweetness of hope. His body slowly began to revive, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to rest. The relief he felt was indescribable. He could hardly believe it. He had made it. He had survived the worst the desert could throw at him, and now he was in the care of those who knew how to navigate this merciless land. But as quickly as the glimmer of hope arrived, it began to fade. The nomads, though kind and compassionate, were not equipped to care for him for long. They were travelers, moving through a vast and unforgiving wilderness, and their route would soon take them far from where Mauro needed to go. After just a short period, they had to continue on their journey, leaving Mauro behind once more. In a cruel twist of fate, Mauro was left alone again, stranded in the desert. The brief moment of salvation now felt like an illusion, and the crushing loneliness returned with a vengeance. The mental toll of this abandonment was profound. He had thought help had finally arrived, but now he faced a harsher reality. The desert had shown him no mercy. The emotional weight of being abandoned by those who had helped him was more difficult to carry than the physical toll of the desert itself. He was, once again, alone in the Sahara. His body still ached from the ordeal, and his mind was clouded by exhaustion and confusion. His thoughts began to spiral. How could he continue? How could he endure after everything that had happened? How much longer could he survive without help, without hope? For a moment, it seemed as though the weight of despair would crush him entirely. But then, a stubborn flicker of determination pushed him forward. He had survived this far, hadn't he? He wasn't about to give up now, not when he was so close to death and yet so close to life. The nomads had given him a brief respite, but it was up to him to finish the fight, to keep going no matter what. And so, with renewed resolve, Mauro forced his weary legs to take another step. His survival was a fragile thread, but in that moment, he grasped onto it with everything he had. The desert would try to break him. But Mauro Prosperi wasn't going to let it. The days seemed to stretch on forever as he stumbled through the endless sand dunes. His body was a wreck, his skin blistered and burned, his mind hanging by a thread. Yet, he clung to the hope that somehow he would make it. Every step was agony, but every step was also an act of defiance against the odds. It was a testament to the incredible strength of the human spirit. Mauro, once lost and on the verge of collapse, had found something in the depths of his despair, the will to survive. His battle was far from over, but it had become a war of resilience, a fight not just against the desert, but against his own inner demons. For days, Mauro staggered through the desert, lost in a nightmarish cycle of despair and fleeting hope. Every day felt like a lifetime. The desert had stripped him of his strength, his sanity, and at times, even his will to live. But as his body deteriorated, one thing never wavered: his refusal to give up. Mauro's body was at its limit. His skin had burned to a deep, painful red, and his lips cracked from dehydration. His stomach was empty, save for the bat blood and urine he had relied on to survive. His thoughts were foggy, his steps slow and erratic. Yet somehow, amid the relentless dunes, Mauro never lost the will to press on, to push forward, even if he didn't know where forward was anymore. But as the days turned into a nightmarish blur, the breakthrough came when he least expected it. Through the haze of fatigue and delirium, he thought he heard something. Voices. He wasn't sure if it was real, but the faint sound echoed through his mind, tugging at him like a lifeline. Was it another mirage, or was this truly his rescue? Mauro gathered what little strength he had left, dragging his exhausted body forward. As he stumbled closer, he saw them. Searchers, part of the Marathon des Sables rescue operation. They had been combing the desert for days, desperate to find him, but they too had nearly given up. But here he was. Against all odds, Mauro Prosperi had made it. When he saw the rescuers, the rush of emotion was overwhelming. The sight of real human beings, of life, was almost more than his broken body could handle. For a moment, he collapsed to his knees, unable to move, overwhelmed by relief. But the rescuers were there in an instant, lifting him up, offering water, and calling for medical assistance. It was over. He had been found. After 9 grueling days of survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth, Mauro had finally made it out of the Sahara Desert alive. The searchers had never imagined they would find him. Most of them had already assumed he was gone. The odds of surviving such an ordeal were slim, but Mauro's indomitable will to live had defied them all. As he was carefully transported to safety, Mauro felt the weight of his journey begin to lift. His body was broken, his mind shattered, but he was alive. In the hours following his rescue, Mauro could barely speak, still in shock from the ordeal he had just survived. The medical team was astonished by his strength and resilience. He had defied the laws of nature. The damage to his body was severe, but somehow he had managed to outlast the Sahara. As the pain of his injuries was treated, Mauro began to reflect on what had happened, on how he had fought with everything he had to stay alive. His body had failed him, but his spirit had carried him through. He realized that the experience had changed him, and he would never be the same person again. The rescuers marveled at the story of his survival, knowing that they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. For Mauro, it was a moment of reckoning. He had been pushed to the very edge of life and death, yet somehow he had emerged on the other side. He had survived the Sahara not just by sheer luck, but by tapping into something far deeper, the will to live. As he recovered, Mauro found himself contemplating the ordeal with a mixture of awe and disbelief. What had he learned from his time in the desert? How could a person survive such a harrowing ordeal? But even as these questions echoed in his mind, he knew one thing for certain. He was a survivor. And that fact, more than any lesson he might have learned, would be the defining part of his story. The Sahara had tried to take his life, but Mauro Prosperi had won.